Hey everybody, welcome to World History. We're starting chapter 27 today, so go ahead and get your notes out and let's get started. And for the sake of spacing, I'm going to put my little bubble up here, just so actually hold on. Over here may be a better option, that way you can still see the title. So chapter 27 is going to kind of bridge the gap between what we just finished with World War I and what we'll be doing next chapter when we do World War II. So it's important to know, and primarily we're going to be focusing on different regions. We'll be doing Latin America today. We'll do the Middle East next time, and then followed by India, China, and Japan before we move on to World War II. So getting into this, by the early 1900s, Latin America's economy was booming. They sold plentiful natural resources and cash crops to industrialized countries like the United States and Britain and France. They also bought products that were made in those countries. And foreign investors are going to seek to control many of Latin America's natural resources. Kind of going back to what they had experienced, remember we talked about this back when we did chapter 20, when all these Latin American countries were declaring their independence. Now you have these foreign investors that are wanting to take control of these resources for themselves. Stable governments are going to keep the region on good footing. But at this point, some had democratic constitutions, but if you remember, like I said back in chapter 20, just because a Latin American country got their independence did not mean they became democratic. In some cases, military dictators or small groups of wealthy landowners are going to hold the real power and take control of those countries. So, getting into section 1, struggle for change in Latin America. We're going to start with the Mexican Revolution. And we have to, of course, at first, identify the causes. The primary causes, starting off with Francisco Madero in 1910, is going to demand free elections. At this point in Mexican history, very limited amounts of groups of people were allowed to vote. And they're really going to want to change that. This gentleman here, Porfirio Diaz, actually had ruled Mexico for almost 35 years, but he's going to resign in 1911, and Madero has actually become president through an open election, but he'll be murdered within 2 years. Following his death, there's going to be a massive struggle for power. I'm going to move my bubble over here again just so you can see the pictures of these two gentlemen. There's going to be a major struggle for power between two radical leaders. In the north, you have a gentleman by the name of Pancho Villa, this gentleman here, who fought for personal glory, but also won many followers. And then in the south, you have Emiliano Zapata, an Indian tenant farmer that demanded land reform for the peasants. So this is the primary cause. We have two radical people fighting for the office of the presidency, and this is going to explode into a full-scale conflict. A secondary cause are other sources of discontent. It's important to remember wealthy landowners were massively benefiting from this point in Mexican history, and the peasants were suffering. They worked on those haciendas or the ranches, large plantations that were controlled by the land-owning elite, and typically they did not own any land or have access to any sort of education. Peasants and factory workers earned meager wages, and middle-class liberals are going to want democracy, are going to resent the Porfirio Diaz dictatorship and what Villa and Zapata could potentially become. They saw them as potentials for another dictator to be on the throne. So, the effects of the Mexican Revolution. There was a lot of bloodshed and death, and by 1917, Venustiano Carranza, a conservative, is going to be elected president. This is him right here. They're going to create a constitution that's going to address the three major issues that had been affecting Mexico for now: land, religion, and labor. Now we're going to see nationalization and the government take over control of these natural resources that people were benefiting from. They're going to break up the larger estates into smaller lands, limit foreign ownership of Mexican land to promote ownership of land by actual people that lived in Mexico, returns some Indian lands to Native American groups, gives the government control over church land, set an actual minimum wage for workers while protecting their rights to strike. They also gave all men the right to vote, so they had universal manhood suffrage at this point. And they're going to grant women some new rights, but no voting yet. It's coming, just not yet. Now, by 1929, so a little over a decade later, the government's going to organize what later became the Institutional Revolutionary Party, or the PRI. This accommodated many groups by adopting the goals of those other groups. And the PRI brought stability to Mexico and carried out a lot of these reforms that people had been calling for decades at this point. Now, some other effects. We had some great social reforms. Schools and libraries were set up so people finally were able to get an education. They're going to help some Indian communities to regain their lands, like I previously mentioned. They're also going to support the establishment of labor unions to benefit the workers. One of the other big things that played into this was an economic sense of nationalism, with an emphasis on domestic control of the economy. They were determined to develop their own economies and end economic dependence on other countries. Now, after World War I, trade's going to fall off with Europe because they're going to kind of go through their own economic depression. We'll talk more about that specifically next chapter, but it led to local entrepreneurs in Mexico to set up their own factories, to make their own goods. They did urge government to raise tariffs to offset those costs. And eventually, other Latin American nations are going to follow Mexico's lead. Now, it's going to have a limited amount of success. Really, post-World War I, when we talk about an economic depression, I'm talking about the whole world. It was not limited to Europe or the United States. It affected every country in some shape or form. That is still true for Latin America. Like I said, the Great Depression, this economic crisis led to no demands for Latin American goods, and the price of imports is going to rise pretty quickly. Now, as we've talked about in previous chapters, effects on the economy are going to trigger political change. People are going to lose faith in oligarchies and liberal governments, and as a result, stronger authoritarian governments of different types will rise in Latin American countries. People are going to hope these governments could control, direct, and protect each country's economy more effectively. That's not always going to be the case, though. Finally, we have cultural nationalism, or pride in one's own culture. We've talked about nationalism before. This was reflected in the revival of mural painting, a major art form from the Aztecs and Mayans that had been lost for a long time, with one famous painter, Diego Rivera, starting to paint murals on buildings. It's one of the most popular art forms in Latin America today. So let me move the bubble again. We're going to move it down here. We have to talk about the good neighbor policy. During these Mexican revolutions, the U.S. is going to support leaders who it thought would protect their investments. By the 1930s, Franklin D. Roosevelt, or FDR, is going to abandon the Roosevelt Corollary, which was named for his cousin, Teddy Roosevelt, who was another president. This also was used to justify U.S. intervention in Latin America. By going against this and abandoning it, FDR is going to promise to lessen U.S. intervention in Latin America. And as a sign of good faith, we're going to withdraw troops from Haiti and Nicaragua and lift the Platt Amendment in Cuba. So pro-American sentiment's actually going to be pretty good. The Platt Amendment was following the Cuban Revolution, where we basically said, yeah, we have every right to intervene if we so choose. We may not always use it, but we may use it whenever we want. But now they're finally moving away from that. Here's a better look of that map that was on the last slide. So again, we were just talking about Cuba, Mexico, Nicaragua, and Haiti as well. All right, that is it for notes for today. You don't have a new assignment today, just to finish your map worksheet. I'll see you all next time. Bye, everybody.